What is the relationship between China and Australia, and what does this relationship tell us about China's relations more broadly with the rest of the Western world? Well, Nicholas Babaya, analyst in the CRA team, has written an article on this topic. Nicholas, could you tell us, first of all, what is the nature of the Australian economy and how dependent is it on its trade relationship with China?
Australia is a very interesting country to analyze because it's a very wealthy country. It's highly developed. It's got an extremely high human development index, high GDP per capita, and so it's very much part of the developed world. However, unlike a lot of developed world countries, Australia has gone a long time without having a recession. That is to say, 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. Where most of Europe and the United States and Canada struggled through things like the 97 Asian financial crisis, the dot-com bubble, the Great Recession that followed the 2008 financial crisis. Australia has by and large powered on, and since I think around 1991, they have not had 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. So they are a very, very strong economy. But a large part of this is due to the fact that Australia is highly mineral rich. So it exports a lot of industrial metals, precious metals, and things like that. And in addition to this, Australia is located uniquely in the Asia-Pacific region, which puts it quite close to China. And it's perhaps no coincidence that in that period of time, from the early 90s up till now, China has seen some of its fastest economic growth in its entire history, really. And so Australia's economy has just sort of trudged along while some other Western nations have struggled from time to time. But a large part of it is due to its highly close economic relationship with China.
So, Nicholas, in the article that you wrote, you suggested that relations between China and Australia not as rosy as they once were. What is the reason for that?
Yeah, well, Australia had a very close relationship with China, arguably much closer than a lot of other Western countries for a long time, particularly in the 2000s. Australia used to have Kevin Rudd as their prime minister. He was probably the first ever Western leader who could speak Mandarin Chinese quite well. But that has slowly been on the decline since around 2010. But in particular, since the year 2018, around the time when Scott Morrison was coming into office, things have gone down pretty fast. A lot of this has been galvanized by the US government's really hard approach on China since Donald Trump entered office in 2016. This has caused a bit of the anti-China rhetoric in a lot of Western nations and the European Union and so on to increase. But in the last 2 years, I would say that Australia has also become a little bit more upstanding to China, especially on the international stage. For example, this year, it signed a military pact with Japan that allows the two countries to share resources and to train together. China saw this as being highly provocative because of border disputes it has with a number of nations in the South China Sea. Australia also at the World Health Organization called for an independent inquiry into the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic. They did not even mention China in this, but China once again found this highly, highly provocative. And there were a number of op-eds written in Chinese state-run media that were extremely critical of Australia. So I think what we're seeing now is Australia on the global stage and multilateral organizations has been standing up to China a little bit more. They haven't been afraid of criticizing the Chinese government in the way that the United States or other Western nations haven't been for a long time. And this is quite notable due to the very, very close economic ties. And suddenly what we're now seeing is that the Chinese are beginning to put tariffs on Australia. And right now it's mostly agricultural goods. But if things get worse, there's a great potential for Australia to lose out a lot economically as China just buys such a massive proportion of Australian exports. I think it's almost a third of the value of exports that China purchases. So and this has been happening, I think, mostly in the last 2 years. And it's very interesting to observe from the perspective of geopolitics.
So, Nicholas, what does this relationship between China and Australia signify about China's relationship more broadly with the Western world?
Well, I think there's a lot to observe here, David. China has a very close relationship with Australia simply because of its economic ties, not nearly as close to, say, a lot of European countries and the United States, although that has also been in a particularly bad place in the last 4 years. But I think the point to make here is this. Australia, in being a little bit more critical of China on the international stage and not being afraid to sort of criticize China and get involved into these diplomatic war of words, is doing something quite interesting because there's a lot to lose economically. China's already slapped on tariffs on a lot of Australian agricultural products, including recently a very, very large tariff on Australian wine. This is going to be devastating for a lot of winemakers in Australia. It's not the big items yet, like products like minerals and mining and so on. But if that were to happen, Australia would have a huge amount to lose. So why then would Australia even be entertaining these kind of diplomatic spats? Well, I think the thing to take away from this is that Australia, just like a lot of other Western nations, values things like democracy and freedom of speech and human rights and so on. And they like to see these things propagated throughout the rest of the world. And as it becomes more difficult to sort of turn a blind eye to these things, the political economic cost of maintaining good economic ties with China becomes greater and greater. So if Australia, a country which has got a huge amount to lose, if there's any kind of a trade war between Australia and China, is willing to criticize China a bit more, I think we should consider really what are the implications of this on other countries in the West, places like Germany, the UK, Canada, and I would include in this places like Japan and South Korea, which have even done similar things, certainly in light of a lot of the opaqueness of the Chinese government in the year 2020. So I think it speaks a lot. And in this way, I like to observe Australia as somewhat of a bellwether for relations between the West, or that you could say the democratic world, and China. And I keep an eye on it always. So very interesting, I think, observations to make from this incident.
Well, thanks, Nick. I think it's certainly worth watching this relationship between these two countries very closely indeed. My name is David Ansara. Please remember, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and check out the link in the description below to our 30-day free trial. Also, let us know what you think. What do these recent tensions between Australia and China tell us about China's relationship with the Western world more broadly? Give us your thoughts. Until next time, take care.